Scientists have spent decades chasing one of the oldest questions humans have ever asked. Why do some people live to 90 or 100, while others don't make it past 60? For a long time, the answer seemed to hide in our genes, in some lucky roll of the biological dice that either gave you good health or didn't. But as researchers followed hundreds of thousands of people across dozens of countries for years and sometimes decades at a time, a different picture started to emerge. Genetics matters, but it explains far less than most people assume. The real story, the one written across study after study, is that longevity is mostly built. It is built daily in small repeated choices that seem too ordinary to matter until you add them up over a lifetime and realize they were the whole game all along. Today, we are going to walk through what the research actually shows. Not vague wellness advice, not trends that disappear in a year, but the habits that keep showing up again and again in the populations who live the longest and stay the healthiest while doing it. Some of what you hear will confirm what you already suspected. Some of it might surprise you. Either way, by the end of this, you will have a clear, practical picture of what actually moves the needle on a longer, healthier life. Let's start with movement, because it is probably the single most studied habit in all of longevity science. Not extreme exercise, not marathon training, just consistent, moderate movement woven into ordinary days. Researchers who studied the so-called blue zones, the regions of the world where people live unusually long lives, found something interesting. The centenarians in Okinawa, in Sardinia, in the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica, in Ikaria, Greece, were not gym-goers. Most of them never lifted a weight in their life. Instead, movement was baked into their environment. They walked to see neighbors. They gardened. They climbed hills to tend animals. They did physical work well into their 80s and 90s because their daily routines simply required it. Modern research backs this up with hard numbers. Large-scale studies tracking step counts found that mortality risk drops sharply as daily steps increase from around 4,000 up to roughly 7,000 to 8,000 steps a day, after which the benefits continue, but level off. This means you do not need to hit some mythical 10,000 step target to get most of the benefit. Even modest increases in daily movement, walking instead of driving for short trips, taking stairs instead of elevators, standing up and moving every hour instead of sitting for long stretches, are associated with meaningfully lower rates of heart disease, certain cancers, and all-cause mortality. One study published in a major cardiology journal found that replacing just 30 minutes of sitting with 30 minutes of light activity was linked to a measurable reduction in death risk. You don't need to earn your health in a gym. You just need to keep your body doing what it evolved to do, which is move regularly throughout the day. Strength matters too, and this is a piece of the puzzle that gets less attention than cardio, but may be just as important as we age. Muscle mass naturally declines after age 30, a process called sarcopenia, and this decline accelerates in our 60s and 70s if nothing is done to counteract it. Studies consistently show that people with greater muscular strength, particularly grip strength, which researchers use as an easy proxy for overall strength, have significantly lower mortality risk than those with weaker muscles, independent of how much cardio they do. This is why longevity researchers increasingly recommend resistance training, even just 2 sessions a week, as one of the highest leverage habits for people over 40. Strong muscles protect your joints, support your metabolism, keep your bones dense, and dramatically reduce your risk of the falls that so often trigger a steep decline in older adults. If there is one habit adults tend to neglect that the research says they shouldn't, it is this one. Now let's talk about food. Because diet is where most people expect the biggest revelations, and in some ways the real answer is almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Across every long-lived population studied, from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Japan, a few patterns repeat themselves. Diets are plant-forward, built around vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, and olive oil, or other minimally processed fats. Meat, when eaten, tends to be a small side element rather than the center of the meal, and it is eaten a few times a week rather than daily. Fish appears regularly in most of these diets. Sugar and highly processed foods are present but rare, saved for genuine celebrations rather than daily consumption. The research on the Mediterranean diet specifically is some of the strongest nutritional evidence we have in all of medicine. Randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of scientific evidence, have shown that people who follow a Mediterranean-style eating pattern have significantly lower rates of heart attack, stroke, and death from cardiovascular causes compared to those on typical low-fat diets. Other studies link this way of eating to lower rates of cognitive decline and dementia. better blood sugar control, and reduced inflammation throughout the body, which researchers increasingly believe is one of the hidden drivers of aging itself. Beyond what people eat, how much they eat turns out to matter enormously. The Okinawan concept of harahachibu, eating until you are about 80% full rather than stuffed, shows up again and again in longevity research as a marker associated with lower rates of obesity and metabolic disease. Caloric restriction studies in animals have shown dramatic increases in lifespan when caloric intake is reduced without malnutrition, and while human studies are harder to run for obvious ethical and practical reasons, the available evidence suggests that chronic overeating accelerates aging through elevated blood sugar, chronic inflammation, and metabolic stress on nearly every organ system. The habit here is not extreme dieting. It's simply learning to stop eating when satisfied rather than when full, and building meals around real food rather than the ultra-processed products that dominate modern grocery stores. Sleep is next, and if there is one habit that gets chronically undervalued in modern life, it might be this one. For decades, sleep was treated almost as a luxury, something ambitious people bragged about needing less of. The research tells a completely different story. Chronic short sleep, generally defined as consistently getting less than 6 hours a night, is associated with significantly higher risks of heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, obesity, depression, and even certain cancers. One large-scale study following hundreds of thousands of adults over years found that people sleeping less than 6 hours a night had a notably higher risk of death from all causes compared to those sleeping 7 to 8 hours. Sleep is when the body performs an enormous amount of its repair work. This is when growth hormone is released to rebuild tissue. This is when the brain's glymphatic system, discovered relatively recently by neuroscientists, flushes out metabolic waste products, including a protein called beta amyloid that is heavily implicated in Alzheimer's disease. Skimp on sleep for years and you're not just tired the next day. You are accumulating a kind of biological debt that shows up decades later as increased disease risk. The habit that longevity researchers consistently recommend is protecting 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep, keeping a consistent sleep and wake schedule even on weekends, and limiting light exposure, especially blue light from screens, in the hour or two before bed, since light exposure at night suppresses the release of melatonin and disrupts the body's internal clock. Now let's turn to something that surprises people when they first hear how strongly it's supported by evidence, and that is social connection. When most people picture a long life, they picture kale and treadmills. Researchers picture relationships. A landmark study out of Harvard, one of the longest-running studies of adult life ever conducted, tracked participants for over 80 years and found that the single strongest predictor of healthy aging was not cholesterol levels or exercise habits, though those mattered too. It was the quality of a person's relationships. People who had warm, close connections with family, friends, and community not only lived longer, they experienced less cognitive decline and reported greater happiness well into old age. Loneliness and social isolation, on the other hand, have been shown in numerous studies to carry health risks comparable to smoking or obesity. Chronic loneliness has been linked to increased inflammation, higher blood pressure, weakened immune function, and elevated risk of dementia. The Blue Zones research found that centenarians almost universally belong to some kind of social structure, whether a religious community, a tight-knit extended family, or in Okinawa's case, a moai, a group of friends formed in childhood who commit to supporting one another for life. This is not a soft, feel-good add onto physical health. It is physical health. The habit here is deliberate. Make time for people. Call the friend you've been meaning to call. Show up for the family dinner. Join the group, the class, the club, the congregation. Isolation is not a neutral default state. It is an active risk factor, and connection has to be built the same way strength or good sleep is built, through consistent small effort over time. Purpose is another factor that keeps appearing in longevity research, sometimes under the Okinawan term ikigai, or in Nicoya, Costa Rica, under the term plan de vida, both of which translate roughly to reason for living. Multiple studies have found that people who report having a clear sense of purpose, some reason to get up in the morning beyond simply existing, have lower rates of mortality, lower rates of cardiovascular disease, and better cognitive function in old age compared to people who lack that sense of direction. One study following older adults over several years found that those with a strong sense of purpose had a meaningfully lower risk of death during the study period than those without one, even after controlling for other health factors. Purpose does not have to mean some grand career achievement. For the long-lived population studied, Purpose was often as simple as tending a garden that feeds the family, caring for grandchildren, contributing skills to a community, or continuing meaningful work well past traditional retirement age. In fact, one of the most striking findings across Blue Zone's research is that very few centenarians in these regions ever fully retire in the way modern Western culture defines retirement. They shift what they do, but they keep contributing, keep being needed, keep having a reason to engage with the world each day. The habit worth building here is reflective. Identify what gives your days meaning, and protect time and energy for it rather than letting it get crowded out entirely by obligation and routine. Stress management deserves its own place in this conversation because chronic stress is now understood to be one of the most corrosive forces on the aging body. Short-term stress is not the problem. The human body is well equipped to handle brief bursts of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. The problem is chronic, unrelenting stress that never gets a chance to resolve. Studies have linked chronic stress to accelerated shortening of telomeres, the protective caps on the ends of chromosomes that are widely used by researchers as a biological marker of cellular aging. Chronically elevated cortisol has also been associated with increased abdominal fat, elevated blood pressure, impaired immune function, and higher rates of depression and anxiety, all of which independently raise the risk of chronic disease and early death. Long-lived populations tend to have built-in mechanisms for managing stress that are woven into daily culture, rather than treated as separate wellness activities. In Okinawa, moments of quiet reflection and ancestor remembrance punctuate the day. In Sardinia and Icaria, the afternoon nap, or siesta, is a long-standing cultural practice, and research has actually found that regular napping is associated with lower rates of heart disease in some populations. Across nearly every Blue Zone, there is some daily ritual that creates a pause, a moment of downshifting out of the sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight state and into the parasympathetic rest and digest state. For those of us without these built-in cultural rituals, the research points to practices like meditation, deep breathing exercises, time in nature, and prayer or spiritual practice for those who are religious, all of which have been shown in controlled studies to lower cortisol, reduce blood pressure, and improve markers of immune function. The habit is not necessarily meditation specifically. It's building in some daily practice that reliably shifts your nervous system out of high alert. Let's talk about substances, because this is an area where the evidence is about as clear as evidence gets in health science. Smoking remains one of the single largest preventable causes of early death worldwide, linked to roughly half of all cases in long-term smokers dying prematurely compared to non-smokers, and associated with dramatically elevated risk of lung cancer, heart disease, stroke, and a long list of other cancers. The good news from the research is that the body begins repairing itself remarkably quickly after quitting, with cardiovascular risk dropping significantly within just a year or two of cessation, even for long-term smokers. Alcohol is a more nuanced story, and the scientific consensus has actually shifted in recent years. For a long time, moderate drinking, particularly red wine, was thought to offer some protective cardiovascular benefit. More recent and more rigorous research, including large studies using genetic methods that avoid some of the confounding problems of older observational studies, has called this into question, suggesting that even moderate alcohol consumption may carry more risk than previously believed, particularly for certain cancers. The safest and most evidence-backed position at this point is that less is better when it comes to alcohol. And if you don't already drink, there is no health reason grounded in longevity science to start. Sun exposure is worth mentioning too, since it cuts both ways. Chronic sun damage is clearly linked to skin cancer and premature skin aging, and protecting your skin matters. At the same time, some sun exposure supports the body's natural vitamin D production, and vitamin D deficiency has been linked in various studies to a range of health problems, including weakened bones and impaired immune function. The habit here is balance. Sensible protection like sunscreen and shade during peak hours, without swinging so far the other direction that you become deficient in a nutrient your body is designed to make from sunlight. Let's return to something we touched on earlier and go deeper, because the connection between mindset and mortality is one of the more fascinating threads running through this research. A well-known study out of Yale found that people with more positive perceptions of their own aging lived on average 7.5 years longer than those with negative perceptions, a gap larger than the benefit associated with low blood pressure or healthy cholesterol levels in some comparisons. How you think about growing older appears to genuinely shape how your body ages. Researchers believe this works through multiple pathways. Positive self-perception is associated with healthier behaviors, lower stress hormone levels, and even measurable differences in cardiovascular reactivity to stress. Optimism more broadly has been studied extensively, and a consistent finding across numerous large cohort studies is that people who score higher on measures of optimism have lower rates of cardiovascular disease and tend to live longer than pessimists, even after accounting for other health and lifestyle factors. This does not mean toxic positivity or denying real problems. It means a general disposition toward believing things can improve and that your actions matter, which appears to translate into real physiological differences over the decades of a lifetime. Let's bring some of these threads together and talk about consistency. Because if there is one meta lesson sitting underneath all of this research, it's that none of these individual habits are magic in isolation. What separates the long-lived populations from the rest of the world is not that they do any one of these things perfectly. It's that they do all of them, imperfectly but consistently, day after day, for decades, without ever really thinking of them as a health regimen. Movement, real food, deep sleep, close relationships, a sense of purpose, manageable stress, avoiding the substances that clearly cause harm. None of it is exotic. All of it is available to nearly everyone, in some form, starting today. The uncomfortable but ultimately hopeful truth in the research is that most of what determines how long and how well you live is not fixed. It's not locked in by your genes or your family history, the way many people assume. Twin studies have repeatedly found that genetics accounts for somewhere around 20 to 30% of lifespan variation in most populations, which means the majority, the larger share by far, comes down to environment and behavior, the very things you have some ability to change, starting with the next choice you make today. So where does that leave you practically? It leaves you with a short list of things worth focusing on that matter far more than any supplement, any trend, or any quick fix ever will. Move your body throughout the day, not just in scheduled workouts, but in the small ways woven into ordinary life. Build and maintain some muscle through resistance training, especially as you get older. Eat real food, mostly plants, without obsessing over perfection. Stop eating before you're stuffed. Protect 7 to 9 hours of real sleep on a consistent schedule. Invest actively in your relationships, because isolation is a genuine health risk, not just an emotional inconvenience. Hold on to some sense of purpose, some reason your days matter to you. Build in some daily practice that calms your nervous system. Avoid smoking entirely and go easy on alcohol. And perhaps most quietly powerful of all, cultivate a mindset that expects good things from the years ahead rather than dreading them. None of these habits require money you don't have, equipment you can't access, or willpower beyond what any ordinary person possesses. They require repetition. They require patience, because the body responds to years, not days. And they require the simple decision, made and remade every single day, to choose the version of your routine that your future self, 20, 30, 40 years from now, will be quietly grateful for. That, more than any single breakthrough or discovery, is what the science of longevity actually comes down to. Small things, repeated for a long time, add up to something extraordinary. And that possibility is available to almost anyone willing to start.